Most people think Christianity is dangerous because of its past, the wars, the scandals, the violence. But Richard Dawkins says that's not the real problem. The real danger isn't what Christianity did, it's what it teaches. Ideas so subtle they slip past your defenses, so familiar they feel moral, so normalized you stop questioning them. Tonight, we're not attacking believers, we're examining the ideas themselves. Because once an idea lives in your head, it doesn't need chains to control you. And Christianity perfected that trick. When morality stops being human. Here's the first dangerous idea, and it sits quietly at the center of Christianity. That morality does not come from human experience, not from empathy, not from understanding suffering, but from above. From authority, from command. In this system, morality is not something you feel, it is something you obey. Inside the Bible, good does not mean kind, compassionate, or humane. Good means ordered. If God commands it, then it becomes good by definition, even if the command involves killing children. Even if it involves owning other human beings as property. Even if it involves wiping out entire populations, the action itself is never questioned. Only the source of the command matters. This is where Richard Dawkins presses his finger into the wound. He points out that the moment morality depends on authority, conscience becomes optional. You stop listening to that quiet internal signal that asks whether something causes harm. You stop measuring actions by their consequences. Instead, you outsource judgment. And once judgment is outsourced, something subtle but dangerous happens. The moral question changes shape. You are no longer asking, "Is this right?" You are asking, "Was this ordered?" And that single shift changes everything. Because if the highest good is obedience, then cruelty can wear the mask of virtue. Violence can be rebranded as righteousness. Atrocity can be explained away as divine necessity. History shows us this pattern again and again, not just in religion, but anywhere authority is treated as morally infallible. Dawkins argues that real morality works in the opposite direction. It begins with empathy, with imagining yourself in another person's place, with recognizing pain when you see it, not excusing it because a powerful voice approved it. When morality is human, it is flexible, self-correcting, and deeply uncomfortable at times. It forces you to question your own side. But when morality is commanded, questioning becomes rebellion, doubt becomes sin, and conscience becomes dangerous. That is why this idea is so powerful and so risky. It trains people to distrust their own moral instincts, to override empathy in favor of loyalty, to feel righteous while doing harm. And once that switch flips, once obedience replaces compassion, almost anything can be justified. And this is only the first layer of the problem, the flood, a moral reset or mass murder. Think about the story of the flood. It is one of the first stories many people ever hear. It is taught early, softly, wrapped in gentle imagery. Animals walking 2 by 2. A wooden boat floating on calm waters. A rainbow at the end, symbolizing hope and renewal. But that version only exists because we have been trained not to look too closely. So read it plainly. Strip away the children's illustrations and comforting music. According to the story, God becomes dissatisfied with humanity, not confused, not conflicted, angry. And his solution is not correction or restraint. It is total destruction. He drowns everyone. Men, women, children, babies, the elderly, the sick. He drowns animals too, creatures with no moral agency at all. Almost all life on earth is erased in a single act of divine rage. That is not justice. Justice targets the guilty. This targets existence itself. What the story describes is global extermination. Now pause and imagine the same logic applied anywhere else. If a human leader decided that people had become immoral and announced that the solution was to wipe out nearly the entire planet, we would not argue about context. We would not search for symbolic meaning. We would not soften the language. We would call that person a monster without hesitation. But when God does it, the story is framed as righteous, necessary, even loving, and that is the part that should unsettle you. Richard Dawkins points out that this story does not merely describe violence, it redefines it. It teaches that scale does not matter when authority is divine. That intention excuses outcome. That mass death can be morally pure, if the command comes from the right source. If this is the foundation, then morality has been flipped upside down. The suffering of victims becomes irrelevant. The emotional reality of pain is erased. All that matters is who holds power. And here is the most disturbing part. This story is not hidden. It is celebrated. It is defended. It is used as an early moral lesson. Children are taught that this act represents justice and renewal, not horror. That conditioning matters, because once you accept that total destruction can be good under the right authority, smaller harms become easier to accept. Obedience replaces empathy. Explanation replaces compassion. And the flood is only the opening act, because once mass death is justified as moral, the next stories no longer shock you. And that is where it truly gets darker. Divine orders and moral silence. The Bible does not merely describe violence as part of a tragic past. It gives instructions, clear ones. There are passages where God commands his people to enter a city and wipe it out completely. Not just the fighters, not just the leaders. The men are to be killed, the women are to be killed, the children are to be killed, even the infants are to be killed. No ambiguity, no hesitation, no moral struggle written into the text. And then comes the detail that makes many people instinctively look away. In some of these stories, the young virgin girls are spared, not for mercy, not for protection. They are spared for the soldiers. That is what the text says. This is not symbolism. This is not poetry. This is instruction. Richard Dawkins argues that this reveals something deeply unsettling about the moral framework at work. This is not a story about good versus evil in the way we normally understand it. It is a story about obedience versus death. Morality is not measured by harm caused or suffering prevented. It is measured by compliance. When morality is replaced with submission, empathy becomes unnecessary. You do not need to imagine the terror of a child or the desperation of a parent. You do not need to weigh consequences. You only need loyalty. Loyalty to the command, loyalty to the authority issuing it. And that is the point where moral silence sets in. Once obedience is elevated above compassion, questioning becomes dangerous. Hesitation becomes weakness. Doubt becomes disobedience. At that stage, the most important moral skill is no longer understanding right from wrong. It is the ability to shut down your own conscience. History has seen this mechanism before, not just in religion, but wherever authority claims absolute moral certainty. The language is always similar. Orders are framed as necessary. Victims are dehumanized. Responsibility is diffused upward. The individual is no longer accountable because the command came from above. Dawkins is not arguing that these stories are shocking because they are ancient. He is arguing that they are dangerous because they are defended, because they are explained away, because they are treated as moral wisdom rather than moral warning signs. Once loyalty outranks compassion, once obedience becomes the highest virtue, the outcome is never mysterious. History does not ask what happens next. It shows us. And the pattern is always the same. Hell, the most effective threat ever invented. Then Christianity introduces what may be its most powerful idea. Not resurrection, not forgiveness, but hell. Not death, not punishment in any human sense, but eternal torture, infinite suffering for finite mistakes. A few decades of human imperfection paid back with endless pain. No parole, no learning. No redemption, just forever. Richard Dawkins calls hell one of the most evil ideas ever conceived, and the reason is simple. It is not justice. Justice has proportion. Justice has limits. Justice ends. Hell does none of those things. Hell is not about correction or protection. It is about control through fear. Think about the logic for a moment. A loving parent does not burn their child forever for disobedience. A loving parent does not create a torture chamber beneath the house and call it moral education. Yet this is exactly how the doctrine is framed. God loves you. God forgives you. God will torture you forever if you fail to believe correctly. The contradiction is not subtle, it is foundational. And here is where it becomes truly disturbing. This idea is not reserved for adults. It is taught to children. Before they can read, before they understand metaphor, before they have the cognitive tools to question it, before they can defend themselves mentally or emotionally. A child does not hear hell as philosophy. A child hears it as a threat, a vivid one. fire, pain, screaming, forever. And once that image takes root, it does not need constant reinforcement. It lives in the background, quiet, persistent, powerful. Fear becomes the leash. Dawkins points out that this is a form of psychological conditioning. You are told you are broken, that you are sinful by nature, and that the cure is obedience, not understanding, not growth, obedience. Believe correctly or suffer eternally. That fear changes behavior, not because it creates virtue, but because it suppresses doubt. It discourages exploration. It punishes curiosity. The mind learns very quickly which questions are dangerous to ask. And fear works. It keeps people inside belief systems long after the ideas stop making sense. It keeps adults haunted by images they were shown as children. It keeps guilt alive even when belief fades. An idea this powerful does not need to be true to be effective. It only needs to be believed early. And once fear is installed at that depth, it does not leave quietly. The atonement, when justice becomes absurd. Now we reach the core of Christianity. Not the hymns, not the churches, not the rituals. The atonement. The idea that Jesus died for your sins. It is presented as the ultimate act of love. A cosmic sacrifice. A story meant to inspire gratitude and humility. But when you slow it down and examine the logic, the meaning begins to unravel. Here is the structure of the story. God creates the universe and sets the rules. Humans inevitably break those rules. God becomes angry and demands punishment. But instead of forgiving, instead of letting go, God requires blood. Justice, we are told, must be satisfied. So God sends himself, in the form of his Son, to be tortured and killed. The sacrifice is made not to humanity, but to God himself. The punishment is demanded by the same being who designed the system, enforced the rules, and defined the penalty. The circle closes perfectly, but only because it never opens. Richard Dawkins compares this to a judge in a courtroom who declares a criminal guilty, then announces that justice will be served by beating his own son instead. The criminal walks free. The violence still happens. And we are expected to call this justice. In any other context, we would call it madness. This is not justice. Justice holds people responsible for their own actions. Justice does not allow guilt to be transferred like a financial debt. It does not accept suffering as a substitute for accountability. Yet, the atonement teaches exactly that someone else can carry your moral burden, that responsibility can be outsourced, that blood can wash away wrongdoing. Dawkins argues that this is not a moral advancement, it is a regression, a return to scapegoating. A Bronze Age idea where the community places its guilt onto a victim and believes the problem has been solved once suffering occurs. And there is a deeper problem. This story trains people to associate morality with punishment rather than understanding, with suffering rather than repair. It suggests that harm must be balanced by pain, not healed by growth. When justice becomes a spectacle of sacrifice, empathy takes a back seat. Guilt becomes permanent, and salvation becomes dependent on accepting a story rather than changing behavior. That is why this idea is dangerous. It feels profound, it feels loving. But beneath the surface, it teaches a deeply confused lesson about responsibility, forgiveness, and what justice actually means. Faith, training the mind to obey. Christianity praises faith. Belief without evidence, trust without verification, acceptance without proof. In almost every other area of life, this would be considered a flaw. If a doctor asked you to take medicine without evidence it works, you would walk out. If a bridge engineer said faith was enough to guarantee safety, you would not cross. Yet in religion, this same mental shortcut is elevated into a virtue. Richard Dawkins argues that this is not accidental. Faith is not just belief, it is a training mechanism. It teaches people to silence doubt rather than explore it, to distrust their own reasoning when it conflicts with authority, to treat questions as moral failures instead of intellectual tools. And once that lesson is learned, it does not stay confined to religion. Science feels threatening precisely because it operates in the opposite direction. Science asks questions. It invites skepticism. It rewards doubt. It treats uncertainty as the beginning of understanding, not a sin to be corrected. Religion, by contrast, hands down answers that are not meant to be questioned. The answers are ancient, fixed. Immune to revision. When you are taught that doubt is sinful, something subtle happens inside the mind. You stop asking certain questions before they fully form. You learn which thoughts are dangerous. You learn which curiosities come with emotional punishment. Over time, the mind adapts. It builds fences around forbidden areas. Dawkins points out that this is how critical thinking erodes quietly, not through force, but through conditioning. You are praised for believing, rewarded for compliance, made to feel virtuous for shutting parts of your mind down. And once obedience is linked to moral worth, thinking independently starts to feel risky. The effects ripple outward into the real world. When evidence contradicts belief, belief often wins. Evolution is denied because it conflicts with a story. Climate change is dismissed because it challenges the idea of divine control. Medical science is resisted when it collides with doctrine. Reality becomes negotiable. This is not because religious people are unintelligent. It is because they have been trained to prioritize certainty over truth, comfort over accuracy, authority over evidence. Dawkins argues that a society built on this kind of thinking struggles to progress. Progress requires the willingness to be wrong, to revise beliefs, to admit ignorance. Faith, as defined here, discourages all three. When you train the mind to obey instead of explore, you do not just protect beliefs, you limit imagination, you slow learning, you weaken the very tool that allowed humans to advance in the first place. And once a mind learns that obedience feels safer than understanding, control no longer needs force. It has already been internalized. Women, slavery, and selective morality. The Bible never condemns slavery, not once. There is no clear statement saying that owning another human being is wrong, no moral outrage, no divine prohibition. Instead, the text explains how slavery should function, how long slaves can be kept, how they can be punished, how they can be inherited like property. The institution itself is treated as normal, regulated, and morally acceptable. Women are placed in a similar framework. They are told to submit, to remain silent, to accept male authority as divinely ordained. Their value is tied to obedience and purity rather than autonomy. In some passages, a woman who is raped is forced to marry her attacker, as if the crime damaged property rather than violated a person. Her consent is irrelevant. Her trauma is secondary. Richard Dawkins points out something deeply uncomfortable about all of this. If this book were the product of a morally perfect mind, if it were truly guided by timeless wisdom, why does it miss the obvious? Why does it fail to state what modern morality considers self-evident? Why no commandment saying, "Do not own human beings"? Why no clear condemnation of treating women as property? These would have been easy additions. They require no advanced science, no modern technology, no future knowledge. They require only empathy. Instead, defenders are forced into selective morality. They explain away these passages as metaphorical or cultural while insisting that other verses remain eternally binding. The problem is that this defense quietly admits the central point. If you must use your own moral judgment to decide which parts of the text to follow and which to ignore, then the morality is coming from you, not the book. Dawkins argues that this reveals the true origin of these ideas. They are not timeless truths handed down from a divine source. They are reflections of the societies that produce them, patriarchal, hierarchical, comfortable with domination, comfortable with inequality. And this selective reading has consequences. For centuries, these texts were used to justify slavery, to deny women the right to vote, to exclude them from education and leadership. These were not distortions of Scripture. They were applications of it. Only when society evolved beyond these moral frameworks did interpretations change. Which raises the unavoidable conclusion: moral progress did not come from the Bible, it came in spite of it. And once you see that pattern, the claim of divine moral authority becomes very hard to defend. Indoctrination, the quietest form of violence. Perhaps the most dangerous idea of all is also the quietest. Labeling children by belief. A Christian child, a Muslim child, a Hindu child. Richard Dawkins calls this absurd, and for a simple reason. Children are not born with ideologies. They are not born knowing theology, metaphysics, or doctrine. Those ideas are taught, absorbed, imprinted, and the way they are taught matters. Often it happens through fear, through guilt, through repetition, long before a child has the ability to question or evaluate what they are being told. Before they understand metaphor, before they understand probability, before they understand that authority can be wrong, the belief is planted early, when the mind is most open and most vulnerable. Dawkins argues that this is not education, it is conditioning. The child is not invited to explore ideas, they are warned away from certain thoughts. They are taught which questions are dangerous and which doubts carry consequences. Curiosity is not rewarded, it is managed. Many adults who leave religion describe the same after effects. Years of anxiety that linger long after belief fades, a persistent fear of hell that returns in quiet moments, shame over normal human thoughts, guilt for desires that require no apology. Even when the doctrine is intellectually rejected, the emotional residue remains. This is because the fear was installed early, before critical thinking had a chance to form. The brain learned the lesson at a primitive level. Safety comes from belief. Danger comes from doubt. That damage does not appear in historical timelines or theological debates. It does not show up in statistics about wars or laws, but it lives in people's minds, in their nervous systems, in their sense of self-worth, in the way they relate to authority, pleasure, and uncertainty. Dawkins emphasizes that calling this harmless tradition misses the point. Indoctrination does not need physical force to be damaging. It works precisely because it feels normal, because it is wrapped in love, family, and community, because questioning it feels like betrayal. When a belief system defines a child, before the child can define themselves, it shapes not just what they think, but how they think. And those mental grooves can last a lifetime. That is why indoctrination is so effective, and why it is so rarely challenged. And once fear is embedded that deeply, removing it becomes far harder than planting it ever was. When absolute truth becomes absolute power. Christianity does not present itself as one perspective among many. It claims exclusivity, one way, one truth, one path to salvation. Everyone else is wrong, not mistaken, not uninformed. Wrong in a way that carries eternal consequences. This idea reshapes how the world is divided. Humanity is no longer simply people. It becomes categories, saved and unsaved, believers and unbelievers, inside and outside. Once that line is drawn, everything changes. Because when outsiders are merely different, empathy is easy. But when outsiders are sinful, misguided, or damned, empathy becomes optional. Their suffering can be rationalized. Their voices can be dismissed. Their humanity can be quietly downgraded. Richard Dawkins warns that absolute belief, combined with divine authority, is one of the most dangerous psychological mixtures humans have ever created. It removes uncertainty. It removes humility. It removes the need to listen. If you believe you possess ultimate truth, disagreement no longer feels like dialogue. It feels like rebellion against reality itself. And when that truth is backed by God, moral breaks fail. History shows what happens when people are convinced that the creator of the universe endorses their position. Violence stops feeling like cruelty and starts feeling like duty. Discrimination feels like moral clarity. Suppression feels like protection. The internal question of, what if I'm wrong, disappears. This is not a problem unique to Christianity, but Christianity institutionalized it with extraordinary efficiency. The belief is not simply that you are right, but that everyone else is eternally wrong, that their lives are meaningful only if they accept your framework, that their culture, traditions, and beliefs are inferior by default. Dawkins points out that this mindset does not require hatred to be harmful. It can operate politely, quietly, with smiles and prayers, but the outcome is the same. Once truth is owned by one group, power follows naturally. Moral authority concentrates, dissent becomes dangerous. And once you believe God is on your side, almost anything can be justified. History does not argue with this claim, it demonstrates it. The most frightening part is not how extreme this idea sounds, it is how normal it has been made to feel. Richard Dawkins doesn't argue that Christians are evil. He argues something more unsettling. That good people, armed with dangerous ideas, can cause immense harm while believing they're doing good. Christianity's most dangerous ideas aren't loud, they're familiar. Obedience over empathy, faith over reason, guilt over growth, fear over freedom. We don't need ancient threats to be moral. We don't need cosmic surveillance to be kind. We have empathy, we have reason, we have each other. If this video made you uncomfortable, good. That's where thinking begins. If you value truth over tradition, curiosity over comfort, stay questioning, stay honest, and subscribe if you believe ideas should earn respect, not demand it.